Do all religions lead to the same place? Boy, of all the people we know, especially in a pluralistic culture, right? We're in a very, very diverse country we live in. There are all kinds of people who believe all kinds of different things, especially about the nature of God. And it's I think, tempting in this kind of world to hope that all roads lead to the same place. Wouldn't that be great if everyone's sincere belief on whatever road they are, whatever religious journey they're on, it would all lead to God? Is that true, though? Do all roads lead to God? Do all religions lead to God? If only it was that easy. Let me give it to you by way of a thought experiment. I think we want to know what's true. Not just any idea will do, especially when it comes to God. All ideas are not created equal. You know, if you were with me and you said, I'm going to make mushroom soup tonight, I really feel like I want to eat mushroom soup. So I noticed before I came into your house, Jim, that there are some mushrooms growing in your front lawn. I'm just going to go pick those mushrooms because, you know, after all, they look a lot like the kinds of mushrooms you see on dinner plates, right? Or in mushroom soup. So you pick a bunch of mushrooms from my lawn and you start making mushroom soup. Now, wait a minute. Now, if those mushrooms are actually toxic, by the way, do you know how to tell if there's toxic mushrooms? I'll just give you a little tip. If there are gills on the bottom of the mushroom, it kills. Gills kill. That's a little extra information free of charge. But if you pick that kind of gilled mushroom and threw it in your mushroom soup, it's going to kill you. All mushrooms do not lead to good mushroom soup. Some mushrooms are actually toxic. And if you put them in your soup, you're going to die from eating that soup. In the same way, all ideas about God, all ideas about the world are not created equally. Some are toxic. They will lead you either to physical or spiritual death. Wouldn't you want to know which of these views is toxic? Wouldn't you want to know which view is true? Wouldn't you want the true mushroom in your mushroom soup? In the end, I think we want to know which view is true and which views are toxic. That's okay. That's the nature of truth. If when I get in a case and I bring someone into trial, that's the suspect who I can demonstrate with evidence is the killer. And that suspect often confesses to the crime after the case. It's not that every single person is equally valid or equally certain that they are the killer. This one, on the basis of evidence, ends up being our bad guy. Well, it turns out we can make an evidential case for Christianity, and we can find out if it's true or false. But if it is true, don't be surprised that it would exclude all the other views. What matters not is how these worldviews feel to you, or how they might, how emotional you might feel about them. What matters more than anything else is which one of those views is true. And that's why we spend time making the case for Christianity. It turns out that every religious view makes a contradictory claim about the way that we are saved or reunited with God, and especially about the nature of Jesus. These are not views that lead to the same place. Instead, these are religious views that hold mutually exclusive notions. So, for example, if you are Jewish, you might believe that Jesus was a preaching rabbi, but you reject the idea that he was God incarnate. Now that means that both of those views, the Christian view and the Jewish view, could both be false, or one of them could be true, but you cannot say reasonably that they're both true because they make contradictory claims. Muslims, for example, would say that Jesus did not rise from the grave. Christians believe he did rise from the grave. One or the two of these could be true, or they both could be false, but you could not reasonably say that both are true because, again, they make contradictory claims. What each view says about Jesus matters. Because if the Christian claim is true, and Jesus rose from the grave, he did something that no other religious leader has ever done. Buddha did not come back from the grave. Muhammad did not come back from the grave. It turns out the thing that Jesus did, the resurrection, is what defines Christianity historically. The fact that it's locked into an event that occurred in the distant past called the resurrection, and it changes the nature of Jesus. Jesus is the only way to God because Jesus alone is God. His claims of deity were demonstrated by the resurrection. That's a very different path than the other paths. And it contradicts the claims of the other roads that don't lead to the same place because they make mutually exclusive claims. That's why it's so important for us to get this one right. Which of these roads you're on, they'll all take you to different places. But if you want to be reunited with God, there is a way It is to follow Jesus of Nazareth, who came, rose from the grave, and proved he was God. Do atheists believe in just one less God than Christians? I was looking through some web pages online and really kind of looking at the comment section. If you've ever looked at the comment section on a blog post, that seems to be where all the action is, right? So someone writes a blog post, and then you have 100 people underneath the blog post in the comment section that are basically just kind of like, a hammer looking for a nail, right? They're just beating each other up in the comment section. That's not unusual today. And sure enough, I heard someone make a complaint, which I've heard so many times before, this idea that, hey, you know what? I, as an atheist, this gentleman was saying, I reject all the gods of mythology. You and I are so much alike. We're actually both atheists, you, Mr. Christian, and me, Mr. Atheist, because we both reject all the gods. The only difference between you and me is I reject one more than you do. And I reject all those gods for the same reason that you reject those gods, but I just reject your God for the same reason you reject Zeus and Attis and Adonis and all the other gods that preceded Jesus. Is that true? Are we just like atheists, but we just, haven't rejected the last God? I think that might make sense if the entire palette of potential gods in history were all equally attested. Or in other words, if there was the same amount of evidence that demonstrated that all those gods exist, the same amount of evidence that we have that demonstrates that Christianity is true, if they were equally evidentially viable, then I think it would make sense that why are we holding on to something that no, that's not the case at all. It turns out that the level of evidence that you might present to make a case for any god of history, of Cyrus, you name it, compared to Jesus, there is no comparison to the amount of manuscript evidence, to the early dating of that manuscript evidence, to the way that evidence was written down and maintained and transmitted over the centuries. A lot of these gods you were talking about in antiquity were not even based on any historical events that you could even test or even find evidence for. The case for Christianity is very different than the case for Marduk or for Mithra or for you name that god that came before Jesus. The case that you could make for those gods is so much less, so inferior to the case you could make for Christianity. You cannot compare these apples and oranges. They are not the same kinds of claims. But let me give you one more way to think about this. Imagine that we are in a criminal case together, in a trial together, and I've presented 6 weeks of evidence that demonstrates that this defendant is the suspect, the killer in our case. And in the closing argument, the defense attorney stands up and he says to you, look, the prosecutor and I agree that every other potential suspect in the world is not guilty of this crime, did not commit this crime. I'm just like the prosecutor, but I have rejected one more potential suspect than the prosecutor has. We are both people who think that there are no suspects in this case. I've just rejected one more. He accepts this as the suspect. This is stupid. Think about this for a second. Is there good evidence that demonstrates that's the suspect or not, okay? Whether there's no good evidence or whether you've rejected other potential suspects does not say anything about whether he's the suspect in the case. The only thing that describes him as the suspect is the evidence you're offering to support his case, the case against him. Either we have a case against him or we don't. But an idea that you don't think anybody else did this murder, so why should we think he did it? Who makes that kind of a case? The issue really is, do you have enough evidence to demonstrate that he did it? When it comes to Christianity, the evidence is there. We have to make the decision. Is there enough evidence to demonstrate that Christianity is true? It matters not how many other possibilities there are. What matters is what's the evidence for those? What's the evidence for this? There's a reason why that guy is the defendant in this case, because the evidence pointed him from the beginning. There's a reason why Christianity is still on the table, although all those other gods are no longer worshipped, because the evidence is on the table. There's good reason to believe that Christianity is true. We haven't just rejected one less God. We've found the one who is God. Starting at the very beginning, we're in a universe that has a beginning. Did you know that? The universe is not infinitely old. The universe began to exist. And we know that not just from Scripture in Genesis 1. Forget about that. We're not going to use any Scripture to make our case tonight. We're just going to use the science that's available to us. Now, I can tell you in every crime scene, and by the way, if you spend 9 years in art school like I did before I became a cop,
The only thing you really can do with that 9 years of art school is you can illustrate your own book, okay? So you're gonna see that I'm using illustrations from the book, which I illustrated just for the sake of, because I could, basically. I once had a case at a crime scene where when I got there was a piece of foam rubber next to the body of the victim. It was from 1988, and for years, nobody could figure out what this foam rubber was. But I knew that this was the key to the entire case. Why? Because how the foam rubber gets in the room is critically important. Did it belong to the victim? Did she bring it in with her? Did it belong to the restaurant where the murder occurred? Had it been there all along? Did it start off in the room? Or did this come into the room when the suspect came in the room? If it's the last one, well, that's a piece of evidence I'm interested in. It turned out that, yes, the suspect was a guy who used to wear boots, but he would never untie his boots. And when he would take his boots on and off, he eventually wore out the cuff at the back of the boot. And on this night, as he was bending down to take the victim's money, the rubber foam from the cuff of the boot popped out. And he left it there. So now I have an origination of a piece of evidence. I now know what caused it. And finally, if I did a search warrant at his house 30 years later, for his entire life, he's been wearing shoes like that and taking them off that way. And every shoe he owned had the same pattern of wear. So it was a powerful explanation for what caused the foam. So why a piece of evidence is in the room is important to me. How it begins to appear in the room is important to me. This idea of origination is critically important. And here we're going to look at something before we can even start talking about evidence in the room. We have to ask the question, how did the room get there? The room in this case is the universe. It turns out there is very good physical evidence that demonstrates we are in a universe that has a beginning. I have an entire chapter on this, and because I love you guys, I'm not going to talk about it tonight. I'm just going to show you the kinds of scientific, philosophical evidence in very different categories that all point to the same conclusion. And that conclusion is that we are in a universe that came into being from nothing. That's not my position as a theist. That is the position of physicists who are doing this work, and that's why the standard cosmological model in physics is called the Big Bang cosmological model. Now, why it's called that, I don't want you to get hung up on Big Bang. Sometimes as Christians we do. Big Bang does not dictate a certain age of the universe, and Big Bang does not also dictate that evolution is true. You can reject evolution, even theistic evolution, and you can reject a given age of the universe, yet still hold the Big Bang cosmology. Because the one thing the Big Bang cosmology teaches from a science perspective is that everything came into existence from nothing. That's huge. And the most skeptical atheists already recognize this. Alexander Vilenkin, who's at Tufts University, is a Russian cosmologist, says it this way: with the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is now no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. And even Stephen Hawking writes it this way. Hawking and Penrose together wrote several volumes. Here he says, almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. Wow, think about that for a second. Big Bang cosmology, the standard cosmological argument, or standard cosmological model, argues that everything began from nothing. And when I say everything, I mean all space, time, and matter. Wait a minute, space? Space is not something, space is nothing. No, space is something. Time is something, and of course, matter is something. Well, if space is something and it's not nothing, what is nothing? Aristotle put it this way: nothing is what rocks dream about. That's what nothing is. Space is something. And I'm not uncomfortable with Big Bang cosmology. Why? Because we know that big bangs require big bangers. Right? And the question, of course, is what is this big banger? Well, I can tell you one thing. It bangs all space, time, and matter into existence, according to the science. And if that's the case, the thing that bangs all space, time, and matter into existence cannot itself be space, time, or matter, because the beginning of that stuff is the beginning of our universe. So whatever this big banger is, it has to be a non-spatial, non-material, atemporal banger. What could that be? Now, atheists, in my book, I spend a lot of time talking about the alternatives. I'm not just going to give you the explanation from outside the room. I want to show you every explanation from those folks who want to describe it from inside the room. And I'll show you why they don't work. But tonight, because I love you guys, I'm not going to kill you with that. But I want to show you one thing for sure. If you work criminal trials, you recognize something. When defense attorneys argue against you, and you have the truth. I've even had cases where after they argued against us for 8 weeks, we convicted the guy, and at sentencing, he confessed to the entire crime. So clearly, the entire time, the defense attorney was arguing against the truth. And when they're doing that, they're doing it usually in one of three ways. One, they're going to argue something that's not supported by the evidence. Or two, they're going to redefine the terminology to make it easier to let them go. Or three, they're going to make some kind of logical flaw. It turns out the same thing happens with explanations from inside the room against the kind of evidence I'm showing you. So for example, this is from the book. Some people will say, well, maybe we're wrong about the nature of time. If we redefine what we mean by time, we can avoid the beginning of time. Okay, that's one possible approach. Some people will say, well, couldn't the universe be expanding, but not from nothing? Maybe it's expanding and contracting cyclically, and we just happen to be in an expansion period right now, which makes it look like the universe came from nothing. But it could be contracted and then expanding again. The problem, of course, is that the science does not help their case because there's not enough mass and gravitational forces to cause the actual. As a matter of fact, the universe is not slowing down in its expansion so it can recollapse. It's actually speeding up in its expansion. Or maybe we've got an issue, but maybe there's a larger eternal environment. By the way, everyone, atheists and theists alike, are looking for the first eternal cause of the universe. Have you ever had someone say to you, well, if you believe in God, who created God? Well, no. The definition of God, from our perspective, is the uncreated creator of everything. So when you're asking who created the uncreated creator, that's a silly question. And by the way, you atheists also believe there's an uncreated creator. Some of you believe it's a quantum environment from which universes emerge. Some of you believe there's some kind of multiverse generator that creates an infinite number of universes. But regardless, whatever you say it is, you believe it's eternal. So here's the problem with these kinds of solutions. They keep you in the room, for sure, but they have evidential problems. So for example, if you try to redefine time like Hawking has done, he'll even admit if you go back to the way time really is, his theory falls apart. And not only that, if you're talking about a cyclical universe, this is not supported by evidence. But there is a theory out there that seems very provocative to some people, and it's called multiverse theory. There's an environment out there that's producing an infinite number of universes. Ours is just but one. But the thing that's creating this universe is something, guess what? It's something external to our universe. So this theory about multiverse theory right away concedes that you have to have an outside source that's creating the universe. The problem with this theory is that it's logically inconsistent for a number of reasons. I'll just give you the clearest one. What is the multiverse generator? What is this environment like that the multiverse generator is in? Think about this. This is what Lawrence Krauss says about this. He's a physicist at Arizona State University. He wrote a book called Universe from Nothing. He was on Stephen Colbert's show, the old show, okay? And he was interviewed, and this is what he said about this environment with this multiverse generator. He says, physics has changed what we mean by nothing. Empty space is a boiling, bubbling brew of virtual particles popping in and out of existence. And if you wait long enough, that kind of nothing will always produce particles. Those particles could then grow into universes. What if there's like a big pot of boiling water that bubbles are emerging in? Each one's a universe. It emerges without a cause and becomes a universe, and there's an infinite number of these. Really? Well, what's the pot of water like? Remember, it can't be space, time, or matter because that stuff begins at the beginning of our universe. But he says that environment is, wait a minute, he says it's empty space. Well, no, Stephen, or Lawrence, it can't be space. Your space is going to be created as a result. You can't start with space to get space. Then he says, well, there's virtual particles. So you have some form of energy in the, wait a minute, no, Lawrence. You can't start with space and matter. We're trying to describe how space and matter got here. Then he says, well, if you wait long, oh, great, so now you've got time too. So what he's basically saying is, if you start with space, time, and matter, you can get space, time, and matter. Well, no duh. That doesn't help us. It's logically inconsistent. And you see this a lot in this kind of thinking. But of course, if there is something out there that's all-powerful, non-spatial, atemporal, non-material, that could begin this, that would explain all of it. This is one piece of a larger case. We have to look elsewhere. For example, we have a universe that has a beginning, but it also appears to be fine-tuned for life. This has been a perplexing problem for atheists for a number of years. As a matter of fact, Antony Flew, when he first became a theist, a deist probably, he did so because of this problem. We're in a universe that appears to be tampered with. I worked a case one year where a lady died in the upper floor bedroom of her house. When I got there and we investigated the background story to this thing, her husband and her had been fighting for years. And they had to turn the gas off in the house, but the husband, who didn't even live there anymore, had turned the gas back on a week prior to her death. Now she's dead upstairs. Why? Because she's been asphyxiated in a house filled with natural gas. Along her and her baby, both. So the question is, okay, we get there. Not only that, but when the mother-in-law first showed up, she saw that right around the house, several things, doors that were not usually open, windows that were frozen in one position had been changed. Never seen that before. Looked like somebody had tampered with the house. And even at the room itself, pocket door that was stuck in place was now closed, and there was even clothing against the bottom of that door, which wouldn't allow the gas to escape from the bedroom, and the pilot light and the upstairs wall heater had been extinguished. Really? When you start to see this kind of tampering at several layers, I think we had a suspect in mind. This doesn't happen. This is not a bad coincidence. I've got tampering at several layers. It turns out this kind of tampering also is seen in the universe. At the foundational level, you see it even at the laws of just weak and strong nuclear forces at the center of the atom. You see that these have to be so finely tuned to within a razor's edge that the smallest variation in the universal constants would create a universe in which no life could emerge. As a matter of fact, physicists don't even think the universe could emerge. If the smallest changes in the strong force and the weak force, in electromagnetism and forces of gravity, even at the level of just the elements themselves, the smallest variation, you would not have a universe like ours that supports life. That's just at the foundational level. At the regional level of our galaxy, galaxies have to be shaped just a certain way in order for life to emerge. You have to be a certain size, a certain mass, a certain shape, a certain location in the universe in order for life to emerge. And we happen to have one of those. We're in it. As a matter of fact, at that same regional level, the star system you happen to be in has to be arranged a certain way, with a certain shape, a certain number of planets, a certain location within the spiral arm. Too close, too far out doesn't work. These are fine-tuned constants that have to be present at the regional level. And then when we get to our planet, oh my gosh, there are certain criteria for the planet that have to be in place. You know, the idea of a planet that supports life is crazy, given what's required. What's required in terms of simple things like the position next to the sun, the tilt of the actual planet relationship to the sun, the kind of atmosphere, the kind of terrestrial crust, the kinds of components in that terrestrial crust, even the size of our moon. These things are absolutely necessary in order for life to exist on planet Earth. So at the foundational level, the regional level, the locational level, everything has to be just so, like in Goldilocks, right? Not too hot, not too cold, but just right. And the margin of error is crazy. Crazy fine-tuned. So it turns out that these kinds of layers of evidence you see in our murder scene are very similar to what we see for life to emerge on the planet. You have foundational layer of fine-tuning of the constants, you have a regional layer of the galaxy and the solar system, and then a very fine-tuned elements related to the planet itself. So these elements, imagine, for example, if I told you we were going to take a ship ride, get in a cockpit of an airplane or a rocket ship, and we're going to go to a very specific place. If you had all of these gauges, hundreds and hundreds of gauges, it turns out you would have to fine-tune each gauge to within a hair-trigger precision measurement. And each one is dependent on the others. All of these have to be perfectly tuned These are all the universal constants of both our universe, the galaxy, the solar system, and the planet that have to be just so. And if there's a small variation on any one of these, life does not emerge on planet Earth, anywhere in the universe. This kind of thing is really hard to understand, how it could be so. I'm going to tell you something. I did this little illustration for you. I didn't even do half of the fine tuning that's required. I didn't have space on this cockpit to do what really is required. The number of universal constants is staggering, and they are all geared toward a certain destination in mind. The destination is a planet that supports the kind of life that you and I experience. Very unique. In fact, I'm trying to quote mostly atheists here. The unique nature of the fine tuning is disturbing for those who don't believe in a fine tuner. Even, you'll see people say things like this: it's shocking to find how many of the familiar constants of the universe lie within a very narrow band that makes life possible. If a single one of these accidents were altered, stars would never form, the universe would fly apart, DNA would not exist, life as we know it would be impossible, Earth would flip over or freeze, and so on. A little bit dramatic, but you get the point. This stuff is incredibly fine-tuned. How do we explain it? Well, there's only a couple of ways to explain it by staying inside the room. One way is simply to say, hey, maybe it's just chance. Really? Okay, can you imagine if I walked into that scene at the house and I said, wow, I see some things, but it's probably just chance. No investigation, let it go. I think you'd say I was derelict of duty. You'd say you need to investigate. That doesn't look like chance to me. This ignores the incredible fine-tuning of the universe altogether. Or you might say, well, maybe it's some kind of physical necessity. Maybe the laws have to be set that way because any variation would be physically impossible. Not true. Physicists themselves will say, no, the fine-tuning of the universe does not have to be this way. As a matter of fact, if you believe in multiverse theory, you believe there are a number of universes that are tuned differently, with a different set of physical laws. So it doesn't have to be. It's not a matter of physical necessity. But maybe we go back to the multiverse. Couldn't the multiverse explain this? If you have an infinite number of universes all slightly different, shouldn't one look like ours? I think so. I think in some ways people rush to multiverse theory because of the fine-tuning they see. By the way, there's no physical evidence pointing to a multiverse. But the fact we can't explain the fine-tuning might incline us to believe in a multiverse. But here's the problem. If we stay in the room by using either chance or physical law, these don't work. And they don't work. I've done entire chapters on this. I won't drag you through this right now. But they're unsupported by the evidence. And even if I could say there was some constant between the physical laws and the level of the atom, that would not explain the unusual galaxy, solar system, and planet we happen to live on. So we go to the third quick thing. Okay, well, maybe it's a multiverse. Once again, if it's a multiverse generator, guess what? You've already conceded an external source. You already agree with me. The best explanation is outside the room, not inside the room. But this has problems because it lacks all space, time, and matter. Remember, we already talked about that. But not only that, if this thing can create the kinds of universes in which we emerge, wouldn't you have to argue that this thing also has to be fine-tuned to some degree? This multiverse generator, Richard Swinburne says it this way. He says, look, any proposed multiverse mechanism, like that pot of boiling water, needs to have a certain form rather than innumerable possible other forms, and probably constants too that need fine-tuning in the narrow sense. So that all you've done is kick the problem of fine-tuning down the road, but you still have to account for fine-tuning. So you have two things. You have two pieces of evidence. If there happens to be an all-powerful fine-tuner who's got a purpose in mind, that would explain this, but he'd have to be outside the, or it, whatever this is, a force, whatever it is, would have to be outside the room. Let's go to the third one. We happen to have life that emerges from non-life. I tell you, that always bugged me as an atheist. Trying to figure out how that could happen is a problem. I had a case one time where a cell phone had this text on it. It was the victim's cell phone next to his body at the murder scene. Here was the text. I wasn't quite sure what to make of it. Is it just a butt dial, an accident? What does that even mean? It didn't seem like it was really information. I couldn't decode it. What's the message? I don't know. Well, it turned out this message came from his wife, Rachel, who had been cheating on him for a number of years he didn't even know. And on this night, she'd had enough. She wanted to kill him. He was working late. He wanted her boyfriend to go over and kill him at the place of business. But he was getting ready to leave, and he had called her and says, I'm coming home. So she texted him to hold him in place so that the boyfriend could kill him. This text, like many other I found before, it basically says, don't go anywhere, I'll be there in 30 minutes. So this is how they would talk about, I'll be there in 30, be there in 15, almost there, whatever. He waited 30 minutes for her and was killed in 20. So this was actually ended up being a piece of information. Now, one way we discover what this is by asking good detective questions, right? These are the kinds of questions we all are familiar with. Am I right? I want to ask just one tonight when it comes to the origin of life to get us started. I ask all of them in the book, but tonight I just want to cover the where question. Where do naturalists who are not believers think life originated in the universe? Because we've all got to account for the origin of life from inorganic materials. And the proposals have been really broad and widespread. Lots of proposals have been offered. As a matter of fact, some people will say, well, I think it happens in the atmosphere. Some will say, no, I think it happens in the actual waters of some nature, some place on the planet. Or they think it happens in some kind of terrestrial form, like on clay. I mean, I studied every single origin of life theory on this. Some will say, no, it happens at the deep sea vents or under the terrestrial crust. Some will say, no, this don't work. It has to happen in the atmosphere. Or it has to happen rather in space and can be delivered to our planet. Why are there so many theories about where this occurred? You know why? Because no one agrees. As a matter of fact, each of these famous scientists thinks the other guy is desperately wrong. He's certain they're wrong, and it gets worse because it goes the other way too. And the reason why they think they're wrong is because none of these work. Every location that's been examined to explain the origin of life fails miserably. Not just slightly, miserably. Origin of life studies are no closer than they were 35 years ago. We've done nothing in terms of progress except made the problem more difficult, because now we know that there are several chicken and egg problems when it comes to origin of life. Really, all life at the biological level, all life is built out of building blocks, Legos, that are called proteins. Proteins are the building blocks of life. The problem is proteins are generated in little factories called ribosomes. And what do you think these ribosomes are made with? Proteins. That's the problem. You've got a chicken and egg problem. Which came first? And to be honest with you, it gets worse the deeper you look. It's not just in ribosome factories. It's in every aspect of the cell, including the cell membrane. You can't get this complex behavior to occur unless it's protected in some way. But the protection for this complex system is made up of the very things that are in the complex system. That's the problem. You got to have everything in place all at once in order to make this work. And that's why it's so hard to locate a place where all of this could happen without any intelligent intervention. And it gets worse, because it turns out there is one thing that defeats the chicken and egg problem. There's one way to defeat it. You know how it's defeated? It's defeated with something we call DNA. This molecule, the largest molecule known in all of science, right? Built from all the different nucleotides that build up DNA. These 4 nucleotides are used to build DNA. This is the instruction manual that tells proteins how to form. It tells ribosome machines how to manufacture proteins. It constructs and directs all traffic in biological systems. The problem, of course, is what is this? This is a series of nucleotides that are in a certain order, like information, like letters, that are directing traffic. Here's the problem, and Stephen C. Meyer does the best job of saying this. Now, Stephen's a believer, but he's also got his Oxford PhD in the philosophy of science. And what he says in a book that is the biggest takeaway about this first book he wrote, Signature on the Cell, is simply this: there's not a single example in the entire history of science or the universe in which information ever comes from anything other than intelligence. So if this is information in the genome, what is the intelligent source that has put it there? Because you cannot get information any other way. Let me show you what I mean. He actually, there's some work I looked at. I love this guy's work. His name is Dr. Werner Gitt. He's an engineer, IT specialist in Germany. He's written a book in which he talks about the 5 levels of information. Why do we think that DNA is truly information and requires an intelligent source? Well, because if you look at information, it comes in 5 levels. Let me introduce them to you. Here's my dog. Do you guys have dogs? I went over to Pastor Paul's house today, and I got to see his dogs. He's got cute dogs. I have a corgi, a Pembroke corgi. This is the best dog in the planet. If you have a dog, your dog is nothing compared to this dog. Pooey on your dog. This is the smartest dog in the world. But it's a dwarf. It's a Pembroke corgi. And they are like little shrunken down sheepdogs. And they cannot type. If I put a typewriter in front of this dog, it is not going to be able to type. But let's just go with me for a second, do a little thought experiment. Let's say I put a typewriter in front of Bailey, and Bailey, I said, Bailey, do me a favor, type me out a sentence. And after banging her little paws against that typewriter, I write down on the chalkboard what she's typed. She's typed this. Is that information? Yeah, actually it is. What is she saying? I don't know. Is she trying to say anything? I don't know. But is it information? Well, in some sense it is. It's very unusual and specific if you think about it. What are the odds of her typing that same thing again? Probably never happened. What if I had Scrabble pieces that in that format and I threw them on the ground? How many times would I have to throw them on the ground before it would form that combination again? Probably never happened. So it is, in some sense, very specific, detailed information. But it doesn't really tell me anything. I think that natural processes of physics or chemistry could get you this. This looks like random generated sequences. What if I give you one more? What if she typed this? This would be really cool. TT spacebar, TT spacebar, TT spacebar. If she did that, you'd say that's a smart dog, wouldn't you? I think there are actually some physical properties, physical processes of physics and chemistry that could produce simple patterns. That's information, folks. But what is she saying? I don't know. Nothing really. What if she had a bigger pattern she typed? Wow. T13 T spacebar, T13 T spacebar. Now she's really, really smart. But what is she telling me? I don't know. Nothing really. But this is information in the sense that it's specific and detailed. And I think there are actually some laws of physics and chemistry that can give you more detail, like snowflakes, great patterns. So is this information? Yeah. But it's the lowest level of information. This information is called statistics. It is the lowest. Is this what DNA is? No. Let's go up one level. What if Bailey could type this? Wow. Now you're impressed, aren't you? She's mastered word selection. She can actually put the letters together and group them into words. But what is she telling me? I don't know. I'm not quite sure what she's telling me. We're up one level. We've mastered words, but we don't have any content yet. This is called concise. What if she could type this? Now we have words in a proper linkage that gives us a concept we can recognize. She's actually telling us something, and we understand what she's saying. Do you see how much different that is than this? How do we get this through natural processes? You can get this. You might stretch and say you can get this. I don't think you can. You can't get this, though. This is another level of information, which is called semantics. I've been places where people have mastered something between these two. They understand the words, but they're not quite sure how to put them together. Maybe English is their second language. I was in Malibu at a Thai food restaurant, right? I go into the restroom. This sign is hanging in the restroom at a Thai food restaurant in Malibu, California on PCH. Please do not throw paper wiping hand down toilet. I think I understand what he's trying to say. And he's somewhere between concise and semantics. He kind of has the right words, almost in the right order. What if my dog, Bailey, could type this? Wow. This is actually a request. Information that requests a response is different than just information describing something. Information that requests action is another level that is called pragmatics. And if you expect that the person you're talking to is actually going to respond and do this for you, that's even another level called apopetics. These are the highest levels of information. Requests with an expectation of response. If you want to know the difference between this and this, one easy way is to simply ask yourself a question. If I change one character, does it change the meaning of this sentence? Of course not. That's not really information. It's the lowest level of information. So if I look at this and I say I just take one character out, the comma, this has no change at all on this sentence because it didn't mean anything before. It doesn't mean anything now. I think some of you know where I'm headed with this from the look on your face. But at the bottom, at the highest level of information, you know it's high information because if I make one change, like take the comma out of that sentence, now everything changes, right? Now the sweet Bailey who was wanting Grandpa to feed her has now become the evil Bailey who wants to eat Grandpa. See the difference? And that's why we know that this information is at a much higher level. Small changes have dramatic changes in meaning. So the same thing happens in your DNA, right? Here's Billy the Kid, or maybe this is Jesse James, I forget who this is. But if I look at his genetic code, the stuff that actually structures who he is, and I make a small change, take out, let's say, this one nucleotide and replace it, that change results in a change in Billy. Something is going to change. Why? Because this DNA is not just statistics. It's the highest level of information. It's a pragmatic request that's expected to be met. This is hard to explain in a naturalistic universe. And even the naturalists recognize that. So Paul Davies, a physicist from ASU, says, we are still left with the mystery of where biological information comes from. If the normal laws of physics can't inject information, and if we are ruling out miracles, which of course they are, then how can life be predetermined and inevitable rather than a freak accident? How is it possible to generate random complexity and specificity together in a law-like manner? We've always come back to that basic paradox. How do you get this by staying in the room? Well, I describe a couple of ways people try to get it. One thing you can do is simply say, oh, it's just chance. You do it long enough, hard enough, these things will happen by chance. But that really misunderstands the level of information involved. Or you can argue that there's some natural law that could cause information. Give me an example of that. You won't. There are no examples of natural law ever giving you anything more than statistical information, the lowest level of information. So if you want to stay inside the room, you're going to have to go by chance or by law. Those things don't work. Why? Because we're seeing true information in the room. And that means you've got to have a source of true information, and that's got to get you outside the room. That's the problem. See, here's the problem with asking these questions. I ask these questions all the time in homicides, but I don't stop here. I don't ask these questions and stop. If I did that, I'd never solve a case. The next question I have to ask is the money question. It's a who question. All these questions point to the who question. If I refuse to ask a who question, then trust me, you're never going to get an answer. So the folks who are doing origin of life, they don't want to ask any who questions. Can't be a who, has to be a what. That's why you can't solve this, folks, because it's a who you're looking for. And this is what Werner Getz says about that. He says, yeah, you're looking for a who. A necessary requirement for generating meaningful information is the ability to select from alternatives. And that requires intelligent volitional entity, because unguided random processes cannot do this. Not in any amount of time, because this selection process demands continuous guidance by intelligent beings that have a purpose. That's how you get information. If the source of that information happens to be an intelligent, communicative being outside the box, I could explain information inside the box. We've looked at those things. Now let's go one more. We seem to see attributes of design in biology, not just the information. You see things in biological structures that speak of design. I had a case one time, it was just on Dateline about 2 months ago. 1979 case, a woman was murdered in this house. In the back room that was an addition to the garage. She lived there. One night, she was murdered while she was in her bedroom. And when we got there, we rolled the body over, and under her body, the killer had left something behind. He had left behind the garrote he had used to try to kill her. Eventually, he had to stab her to death because the garrote didn't work. But I can tell you that the minute they saw the garrote, the officers said, we should probably collect this, because this looks like a designed object. Because this could be explained by some accident or some piece that came off the tree next to her bed or some piece that came off the bed itself. But no, there's something about this that shows It's something we recognize. It's an artifact. It appears to be a designed weapon. And that means you've got to have an artisan and a designer who would actually be responsible for such a thing. So what is it about the garrote that they recognized immediately that it was designed? Philosophers and thinkers have been thinking about this for a long time. There are some good ones out there. I take a slightly different approach. It's a cumulative approach. Remember, the more pieces that point to the same inference, the more reasonable the inference. So when it comes to this garrote that was used to kill this woman, I think I see 8 things. 8 things that I recognize as attributes of design. After spending 8 years as a designer before I became a police officer, I recognize these things in design. I'm not gonna, again, because I love you guys, I'm not gonna make you go through all 8 of these. But things I'm talking about are really, can just chance alone describe it? No. Can natural law get you there? No. There seems to be a certain goal direction, something in mind. When he put those handles on the end, you knew what he was gonna do. He's gonna pull tight, doesn't wanna cut his fingers. So even the handles alone give you a certain idea of his goal direction, right? And there's certain information. Actually, when I went to the search warrant at his house, he was thinking of 2 ways to kill her, both of which were silent. One was a garrote, one was a crossbow. Crossbows don't make any noise. So he still had the plans in his house for the crossbow. So interestingly, he was just being driven by plans. There's a certain amount of sophistication, irreducible complexity. What is that? Well, that's when you have to have many pieces in place at the same time before it'll work. If you've got something that one piece, a rope by itself, you might say, well, if it's only a rope, heck, that could be left over from who knows what. But there's 3 pieces here. This does not work until all 3 pieces are in place. It's irreducibly complex to 3. The more pieces are required, the more sure mousetraps are irreducibly complex to 6 pieces. That's why we know they're designed. When you start seeing these things, they all point to the cumulative case for design. Those officers knew that was a designed weapon because those 8 attributes are there. As a matter of fact, if a detective would have come along later and said, don't collect that, that's nothing. That's not designed, that's nothing. Really? The officers still would have collected it. You know why? Because if you're gonna tell me that something that is so obviously designed is not designed, that it got there some other way, well, that burden's on you, not on me. I see the attributes of design, I'm collecting it. Don't think the only burden is on us, folks. If I can explain this through some natural process, that burden is on you. I could take this template and apply it to other things. Here's a bougainvillea tree in front of my house, right? In that tree, I often find what? Nests. Do I think this just happened because the wind blew it together? Does it grow in the tree that way? Or is it the product of intelligent design? Birds who intelligent, look at how, this is actually very, very beautiful. It's got the thicker things on the outside. It's nice and soft, fine on the inside. You can almost tell what it's for just based on its design. And it resembles other designed objects like bowls we already know. Now you might say, well, I don't see a certain informational dependency. I don't need DNA to get that. And I don't see a certain, fine. You don't need all 8 things to know it's designed. The more you have, the better the case. But it turns out you only have 5 attributes of design here, and you know that's not just from the wind. That's a designed object. And you got there with just 5 of the 8 attributes. Why do I tell you all this? Because let's take a look. And you can take out those 3, you still have a good case. That's a good case for design. I'm introducing this to you because Michael Behe, who's become a friend, he actually read my chapter on this issue so I could make sure I wasn't writing any checks I couldn't cash. He was great. And he actually saw something years ago that he identified has become kind of the icon of the intelligent design movement. He wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box. What he discovered in bacterial organisms is a little motor that drives the bacteria. The motor is called a flagellum. And it looks like this. In the wall of the bacteria is a motor made of 40 proteins assembled in a very specific formula, very specific pattern, which builds out this whipping tail that can stop on a dime, turn directions, and bend any way it wants. And this whipping tail is what drives bacteria. The question is, how in the world does that 40-piece protein machine ever get like that? This is a motor, a rotary motor we didn't even discover until 1978. By that time, we were making rotary engines for years. It looks just like our rotary motors. Yet we're gonna ask the question, can I get this through by staying inside the room? Through some natural process of law? Or do I have to go outside the room to get this? I think we see the same 8 things. I do a whole presentation where I just talk about what these 8 things, I'm not gonna do that to you. But the point is, we have at least 6 of these things. Even if you're gonna say, I don't see 2 of them, fine. I think I actually are there. This is enough for me to infer design about that motor. It's kind of like this. If I was to take you out in the woods and I said, wow, we discovered this stand and a motor on it, would you say, look what the wind blows. This is a great, look what grows in these woods. No, you would know immediately this is not part of that environment because you recognize, again, that it's not natural. It's a product of design. Why? Because there are a number of attributes which you assign to this. It turns out biology is filled with molecular machines just like this. And this is why the famous atheist Richard Dawkins says it this way. He says that really biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. So even he recognizes that this is stipulated. This is what you see. And Richard Dorrit says, these are both atheists. Here's what Robert Dorrit says it this way. The apparent fit between organisms seems to suggest some higher intelligence at work, some supervisory gardener bringing harmony and color to the garden. That's the problem. So how do I explain that motor naturally? By staying in the room? Some have suggested, well, maybe it evolved from a slightly less complicated thing called a type 3 secretion system. That type 3 secretion system does look a lot like the motor, doesn't it? It is dramatically different in function. It may look like the motor, but it has nothing similar to what it actually does, the motor does. Here's the other problem. This is a 30-piece designed object. It has all the attributes of design we see in this one. The question I have is, how did this one come about? If you think we got from 0 proteins to 30 to get this, can you please show me the pathway from 0 to 30? Because remember, in biology, if evolution is true, you got to have a 1 protein thingamajiggy that helps the organism, that survives and passes on, till then it becomes a 2 protein thingamajiggy, then a 3 protein thingamajiggy. You got to show me a pathway, a functional pathway from 0 proteins to 30 to get this. Then you got to show me from 30 to 40 to get this. Guess what? No one can find that. And there's no remnant in the biological systems of anything along the way. Now, evolutionary biologists are more inclined to say, you know what? I can't get this from this, but this may have de-evolved into this. Because they know how hard it is to go in the other direction. It's much easier to get broken Lego pieces than to shake the Lego machine, the Lego box, and get all the pieces to come together. It's easier to break them apart. So if you're gonna stay in the room by offering some form of evolution, good luck with that. Knock yourself out. Of course, the problem is that we see the attributes of design, but what kind of force could actually design? Design requires choices to be made. You've got to go back outside the room. And this is why Michael Denton says it this way, that each constituent utilized by a cell for a particular biological role, each cog in the watch, turns out to be the only, at the same time, the ideal candidate for its role, particularly suggestive of design. Moreover, there's simply no way that such prefabrication could be the result of natural selection. But if there is something that is capable of designing on the outside, that might explain it.
So what about the challenge that things change over time? Right. You know, things get more elaborate and Jesus goes from just being a wise teacher to a supernatural son of God over a period of time.
Right. Well, you trust your Gospels? Oh, the earliest Gospel's Mark, you know that, right? The last Gospel is probably John. And you trust these things. Well, in Mark, there's no passion story. Jesus is hardly even described as divine at all in Mark. Oh, but by the time we get to John, 30 years later, oh, he's already God now. That's the kind of the accusation, right? That Jesus changes over time. And there's a guy we know, Bart Ehrman, out of North Carolina, who's written a lot of books on this. He just wrote a recent book, 2 books ago now, called How Jesus Became God. Because the Jesus of Nazareth, he would say, was very simple, and then over time he got distorted. They added the miracle accounts, they added the resurrection, they added the high Christology of Jesus, until finally you have the divine Christ of Christianity. I suspected that too, because I was a committed philosophical naturalist. I rejected miracles. So I thought those miracles cannot have been written early. Something was written early, but that stuff wasn't in there. That stuff had to be late. And so I just needed to know, was the miraculous nature of Jesus in the earliest accounts? So here's how we tested it. You know, if you have a crime scene, and I find a casing in the crime scene, and then 30 years later I bring the casing to court and I say there's an extractor pin mark on the casing that identifies it to the suspect's gun, that's why I want you to convict this suspect, you could rightly ask, well, how do I know that that extractor pin mark was on the original? Someone could have pulled it out of property, 15 years later, etched on the extractor pin mark, put it back in property, and now it's been altered. That's a fair accusation, I think. How do I know that that mark was on the original? Here's how I know. I go back and I ask the question, was there an officer there back in the day, 1980, who wrote a report, a supplemental report, where he described the extractor pin mark? Because if he did, I know it wasn't added later. And then he gave it to somebody. The next guy who takes that piece of evidence, he writes a report describing what he received from the first officer. And then the next officer does the same thing. And we do it through time to the crime lab and from the crime lab all the way to the courtroom. And now I have report after report after report to see if anything's changed on the casing. Well, there's a new, this is, by the way, called the chain of custody. Link by link, we look and see who is each link and is it changing. Do the same thing with the Gospels. Let's take a look at the Gospel of John. Was he really that divine in the beginning? Well, the first officer at the scene who wrote a report was a guy named John. He described what he saw in Jesus. But how do I know that he really wrote that? Well, who did he give it to? Who is the next link in the chain? 3 guys were his personal students, Ignatius, Polycarp, and Papias. Now, after John died, these 3 guys became leaders in the local church. If you didn't have John's gospel, you could just ask them, what did John say about Jesus? And they wrote local letters to local congregations. They're not in your Bible. They're ancient documents. We still have them. We can read them and see what did they say they learned from John. And they had a student named Irenaeus, and he had a student named Hippolytus. And you can go through the entire list of history and look at each link in the chain to see, is the story of Jesus becoming more extravagant? And here's what I discovered right away, is that if you start early, everything about Jesus you're stuck with. You may not like it, but it starts very early. And the very first people that John talks to will describe him as being divine, claimed to be God, rose from the dead as God, worked miracles as God, born of a virgin, died on a cross, rose from the grave, ascended into heaven, seated at the right hand of the Father. Every doctrine that we hold dear today is present immediately in the first story of Jesus. So you're stuck with this weird deal. You have people who are telling us something, and they never change their story. And we can document it all the way back to the life of Christ. What do we do with this? What do I do with this? That's where I found myself. I was stuck with the miraculous Jesus of Christianity. And every way I tried to kind of look at it and see, was it a lie? What's motivating him to lie? I tested it every way I could. I was stuck with it.
Sometimes people will ask me, well, how can you be sure that the disciples who either wrote Scripture or who testified about Jesus in the first century weren't lying either about the resurrection or about the details of Jesus' life? Could this whole thing we call Christianity just be a fabrication, a lie on the part of the disciples? Well, I kind of have 3 answers for that and 5 answers to that. I'll give it to you quickly. The 3 is this. In all my work as a detective, I've learned that people only commit a murder for one of 3 reasons. That's it. And the same is true for lying, stealing. We only lie, steal, cheat, sin, commit murder for one of 3 reasons. These are the only 3 motives that drive bad behavior. You ready? It's not hard to figure out, actually. 1 is financial greed. 2 is sexual or relational lust. And 3 is the pursuit of power. So if we're going to suggest that the disciples lied, it would only be for one of those 3 reasons. And ask yourself, what did they get out of this in those 3 areas? Did they get wealth? Did they get lots of girlfriends? Did they get in a powerful position? Think about Paul. Paul started off in a powerful position, writes most of the New Testament, and ends up struggling through he's chased all over the empire and ends up suffering for his faith. To do what? To eventually go back and be in a position of power he started off with? He could have stayed where he was and had power. So in the end, I'm looking for motive. And I don't see any motive for these folks to lie, but there's even more. The 5. Remember I told you about 3 and 5. There are 5 things that are required for anyone to successfully pull off a conspiracy. Maybe you haven't thought about that. Here they are. Smallest number of people who are conspiring together. 2 people can lie, tell a secret, keep a secret more easily than, say, 22 or 222. Also, keep it for the smallest possible amount of time. Keeping a secret for a day is easier than keeping a secret for a year. Also, great communication between co-conspirators. If I stop one of you and question you, you better be able to tell the other person what you told me so I can get the same data from the second person. 4, have good, strong family relationships, because family members don't ever rat off on each other. They don't tell each other's secrets. And lastly, 5, no pressure. If no one's applying pressure, don't worry about it. You're going to get away with it. Now, ask yourself the question, were those 5 necessary requirements for a successful conspiracy available to the disciples? There's far too many of them. Remember, Paul says there's over 500 who saw the risen Christ on the same day who were available to the Corinthian church to be interviewed. Really? If you told me there's a conspiracy with 500 people, I would already say that's not reasonable. And then they're going to hold it for how long? Over 60 years? Really? So 500 people keep this secret for 60 years. And then how do they communicate with each other to make sure the story stays the same when they've been separated all the way from India to Spain? Really? They're not Snapchatting each other in the 1st century, okay? So how are they keeping the secret together? And are there some family members? Yeah, there are some brother groups there, but Matthew is not related to anyone. He writes a gospel. What's in it for him? He was the tax collector called Levi, who wasn't even a disciple of John the Baptist, who then ends up holding on to this claim his entire life and then dies miserably as a result of it. And finally, do they suffer any kind of pressure? Yeah. As a matter of fact, we know that many of these folks were martyred for their beliefs, and we have no record of anyone ever recanting their beliefs. So if you ask me, is it possible that they could have lied? Well, anything is possible, so I will typically say yes, but it is certainly not reasonable, and that's the standard, beyond a reasonable doubt, that I want to meet when I'm trying to decide if someone is lying to me.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that introduction. And indeed, the first lesson of canon is spelling it rightly. So I tell my students all the time, if you're going to pass my papers, at least start there. Get the spelling of it correct. But no, it is great to be here at Ligonier. I've done a number of things for Ligonier in the past, writing and doing the radio show, but have yet to speak at an event, so it's a pleasure to be here. And what makes this event special is not just the folks I'm sharing the stage with, which are scholars in their own right, and it's such a blessing to be among them, but about this time last week in Charlotte, North Carolina, the low was 7 degrees. And so as I flew down here and saw the weather report, I thought to myself, I have found my home. In Orlando, Sanford, Southern Florida, what have you. And so it is great to be with you. Unfortunately, I have to get back on a plane in a few days and leave. But I trust my weather will have warmed up by then in Charlotte. Now, I can't imagine a title of a conference more fitting for my own area of interest than this one, Scripture in the Early Church. They've asked me to speak on God's Word in the early church, and as you might guess, that's an enormous and vast topic. And so I want to narrow down our time together. We only have a limited amount of time together to talk about a more specific subset of that. And I want to begin in a very unusual place today, in a way you probably don't expect to talk on Scripture in the early church to begin. I want to begin by talking about Muhammad Ali. Now, I know you're thinking, now that's the strangest thing I've ever heard. Here we are at a Ligonier conference at Reformation Bible College, and we're talking about Scripture in the early church, and they just read off all this list of titles, and I'm going to talk about the boxer Muhammad Ali. What in the world? But I'm not going to talk about the boxer Muhammad Ali. I actually want to talk about the shepherd Muhammad Ali. In fact, the shepherd Muhammad Ali is probably a person you've never heard of before. But in 1945, Muhammad Ali, in a little town called Nag Hammadi, Egypt, stumbled upon what is arguably one of the most fascinating, controversial, and interesting archaeological discoveries in the history of the modern world. Muhammad Ali was out in his field, as a good shepherd would do in 1945, digging in the ground for fertilizer to help his crops and his animals and so forth, and he was with his brother Sharif Ali, and as they're digging in the ground, their shovel hit something hard. In fact, it's almost like something out of a movie. They began to sweep the dirt away, and as they swept the dirt away, they uncovered this earthenware jar. And at the very top, it was sealed. And they began to wonder what might be inside. Now, of course, this is where Muhammad Ali had his delusions of grandeur. He thought, wow, this could be the moment I've been waiting for. Buried treasure. Surely inside here is gold and jewels and all sorts of things, and our problems are solved. We don't have to be shepherds anymore. We can be rich and famous and so on. But his brother Sharif Ali said, hold on, don't break it open. There might be a genie inside who will curse us. Now, of course, back and forth the debate went, and finally decided that the potential treasure inside was much more important than being cursed by a genie, so they cracked it open. And they were grandly disappointed. Because what they found inside was not treasure. What they found inside was not books and not gold and not jewels. What they found inside, in fact, were boring old books. In fact, books they couldn't even read. Books written in a language that had long been forgotten, books that seemed bizarre and old, books that were brittle and boring. They thought, what in the world are these? And they figured, oh, I wish it had been gold. And they ended up selling off these books to the latest antiquities dealer for hardly anything at all, not realizing they discovered one of the most interesting collections of writings in early Christianity, what ultimately became known as the Gnostic Gospels. Now, the Gnostic Gospel is just a phrase we use that describes this collection of writings. Actually, it was 13 codices, individual books, and inside those 13 codices were 52 individual writings, what we call tractates. And at the center of these Gnostic Gospels became one of the most famous books that you and I have heard of out there that never made its way into the New Testament. It's a book that the media loves to talk about and that scholars love to sort of dive into. It's a book known as the Gospel of Thomas. Muhammad Ali had discovered an entire collection of books that did not make it into our New Testament canons. And at the center of it was this book, esoteric and strange, known as the Gospel of Thomas. And if you read Thomas, yes, you're reading purportedly about Jesus, but when you read Thomas, you realize this doesn't sound like the Jesus I know. This Jesus doesn't talk about himself as divine, but kind of talks about us as divine. This Jesus doesn't talk about salvation from the outside. This Jesus talks about salvation from the inside. This Jesus is not saying the normal things we expect Jesus to say. And so the Gospel of Thomas became one of the most interesting and fascinating Gospels to media critics and scholars all over the world. And Muhammad Ali had discovered it without even knowing it. Now, ever since that time, in 1945, the Gospel of Thomas has captured the fascination of our world. People in our world are fascinated with lost gospels, and that really brings us to the topic before us today, and that is what I want to focus on in this narrow window of discussion on Scripture in the early church is, what about those gospels? Why are those not in the canon? And for that matter, what do we do with the stories of Jesus in there? I mean, what if someone came along and said, look, aren't these just as valid as the stories of Jesus in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? And why should we prefer Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? And maybe Gospel of Thomas is the real version of Jesus, and maybe our Gospels are the wrong version of Jesus. How do we know we have the right Gospels and not the wrong Gospels? Now, you and I, as we think about interacting with our modern world, have got to have an answer to that question. The reason is because our neighbor, who's not a Christian, reads Time magazine, and it seems like every Easter or Christmas there's an article in there about something related to Christianity, and usually they bring up things like the Gospel of Thomas. Or you have another non-Christian friend who took a university class, and they had a famous professor there who told them all about apocryphal Gospels and how those are really more important and more authoritative and probably more likely to be true than the Gospels you're reading. And so as believers, we have to have some answer to that question. So here's what I want to do today. One shot at a conference like this to help you think about Scripture in the early church. I want to help give you the reasons why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John stand out as unique among all the Gospels in the history of early Christianity. In other words, what I want to do today is I'm going to lay out 4 basic facts, which actually, when you hear them in a moment, you're going to think, well, I knew that fact, and that fact's not that hard to remember. 4 basic facts about our canonical Gospels that remind us why they're unique, why they're distinctive, why they're different than the Gospel of Thomas, and why they ended up in the canon and not these other Gospels. And my hope today is that these, in some sense, will be sort of 4 talking points that you can sort of tuck away in your mind and hopefully at some point bring up in a conversation with your neighbor or non-Christian friend, or maybe even just a Christian who's struggling and wants to know an answer why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John really are unique among the Gospels in early Christianity. Now, before I dive into those 4 sort of talking points, I want to first dial things back a moment and ask a larger question before we get into that. I want to sort of set the scene by asking a question about why our culture is so fascinated with lost gospels in the first place. I don't think there's any real doubt that our culture is. It's interesting that this is one of those topics that transcends the academy. I've been interested to observe over the years that in academic circles, we scholars like to talk about lots of things that for most laymen, relatively boring. If I bring up some topics we like to discuss, I can see the eyes glaze over and you're checked out 5 minutes in. But what's interesting is you bring up a lost gospel and everybody's listening. Layperson, scholar alike. And you know what? The scholars know this, and that's why you've probably seen over the last 10, 15, 20 years a push to put in front of you these lost gospels, to rattle your confidence in the stability of the canon. There is a fascination in our world in these other stories of Jesus, what we call apocryphal gospels, and I want to simply ask the question, why? Now, I have my own theory on this. It's not really a theory. I think there's good reasons to think there's something that's led to this. And let me just give you my sort of big picture here. I'm confident there's a link between our culture's fascination with diversity and our culture's fascination with lost gospels. And let me explain what I mean. When I use the term diversity here, I'm not talking about ethnic diversity or cultural diversity or racial diversity. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about our culture's fascination with the diversity of ideas, with the diversity of religions, with the diversity of thought, a diversity of convictions. It doesn't take much living in our modern world to realize that there's a drip, drip, drip all around us in our world of our culture telling us, look at all the different religions, look at all the different philosophies, look at all the different worldviews. They want to put that in front of us regularly and all the time. And by the way, they're right about all the differences. There's no one disputes the extent of the diversity of ideas. But it's this next step that our culture takes that's so key. They don't just observe diversity, they draw an implication from diversity. And it's that second thing that's so noteworthy. In other words, we can agree with our culture, there's a lot of diverse ideas out there. I mean, who's going to dispute that? But then our culture says, because there's so many diverse ideas out there, therefore no one view can be right. And it's that second step, the implication that's drawn from diversity, that's so significant in our culture. And you know what's interesting is that most of us don't notice the second step. They move so seamlessly from observing diversity of thought to the implication that therefore no one view can be right that we don't even notice that there's a leap between the two. The first is undisputed. The second is highly doubtful. Just because there's a diversity of ideas and views of something doesn't mean there can't be one view. Now that idea out there in the culture broadly, and this is what I want you to see, has seeped into the world of scholarship. It's actually seeped into the world of early Christian studies in particular. This has a whole historical background to it I can't go into here in our session, but when you trace the history of scholarship, there's been this fascination with finding diversity in early Christianity. It showed that there's not just one Christianity in the early church, but Christianities, plural. So scholars will look at early Christianity and say, well, there's no such thing as Christianity in the first 4 centuries, because everyone disagreed about all kinds of things. There was controversy and doctrinal dispute. So there wasn't Christianity in the first few centuries. There was Christianities, plural. And here's the catch. And each version of Christianity in the early church had its own books. So therefore, in early Christianity, you might have one version of Christian thought, maybe a Gnostic thought or a Docetic thought or some sort of monastic thought, or maybe you were a Montanist or whatever happens to be in early Christianity. Each of those groups has their own set of writings. So modern scholars say, and your neighbor says to you, what's so special about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John anyway? That's just the books of that one subgroup within early Christianity. What if another group had won? What if the Gnostics had won? If the Gnostics had won the theological wars in early Christianity, you wouldn't be reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If the Gnostics had won, you'd be reading the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Truth. So your canon, so to speak, is just the result of accidental and arbitrary events in history, and there's nothing any more special about those books than Thomas or any other. And here's the big payoff. If that's true, then when it comes to which Jesus you prefer, you can just find the book that has the Jesus you like the best. And this is where I think we really get to the nub of it in terms of our culture's fascination with lost gospels. Why does our culture love lost gospels? Because they don't want there to be one way. They don't want there to be one option. They don't want there to be one particular version of Jesus. What our culture wants is a plethora of versions of Jesus, so you can just pick the Jesus you happen to prefer. If you like the Jesus in Thomas, well, great, that's just as valid. If you like the Jesus in the Gospel of Philip, that's just as valid, says our world. And so what I want you to see is that the debate over these lost gospels has to be set within a larger cultural conversation about the diversity of ideas. And you can see that that's pressing in on the debate, and the major message to you is simply this: it doesn't matter what gospel you read. They're all equally valid. None are more valid than any other gospel. You can just pick the Jesus that suits your fancy in whichever gospel you happen to prefer. Now, I can tell you something. That narrative is persuasive to most people, but here's the big problem with it. That narrative only works if you decide you don't want to do any historical investigations. That narrative only works if you want to stand sort of unaware of the actual data about the individual gospels. So what I want to do is I want you within that backdrop now to hear the four basic differences in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the four things that make those unique as opposed to gospels like Thomas, and you'll discover something very quickly, and that is, wait a second, all that rhetoric about all gospels being the same actually doesn't work if you actually know something about these gospels. And that's what we're going to do. So here's the four things that we'll dive in, and we're just going to work through these one at a time, and hopefully these will be the kind of four sort of principles you can take home, four things that set our gospels apart from gospels like Thomas. And the first is simply this: our four gospels, the canonical gospels, are the earliest gospels we have. They are the earliest gospels that we possess. Now, what's interesting about that first point is how utterly basic it is, how simple and uncomplicated it is. It's simply this: our four gospels are the only gospels that take us into the first century. They're the only gospels written in the first century. They're the only gospels dated to the first century. What's curious about that fact is that it's actually pretty much a scholarly consensus that the four gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are dated to the first century. In fact, it's not only a scholarly consensus that those four gospels are dated to the first century, it is a scholarly consensus that no other gospels in existence are dated to the first century. All are second century or later. Now, I can tell you something, in the world of scholarship, there's very rarely a consensus on much of anything. You get 4 or 5 scholars in a room and just throw out a subject and, good luck getting them to agree. In the world of biblical scholarship in particular, there's hardly any consensus on things. And the fact that you could have consensus on this fundamental point is stunning. Now, every once in a while, there'll be a scholar who gets up the gumption to say, hey, I'm going to give it a go again and try to get some other gospel dated to the first century. And they often do it with a gospel like Thomas. And they say, well, I've got a new argument now. I've got a reason to think Thomas really is a first century text. And they try to push it back. And the scholarly community listens for a little bit and goes, yeah, not working. And they always end up in the same place. The only four gospels written in the first century are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They take us further, deeper, closer to the actual events they purport to record than any other gospel available to us. Now, in the world of historical study and historical investigation, if you want to ascertain the reliability of a document and whether the history it's recording is reliable, the basic rule of thumb is you want that document to be written as close to the events it purports to record as you possibly can get. I mean, think about it with me for a moment. What if our earliest gospel was written in, say, 400 AD? Just think about that. You would have an obvious question. Wait a second. If it was written in 400 AD, well, how does someone in 400 AD remember anything that happened in the first century? I mean, couldn't the story have been changed and modified? And how do we know it was reliable? And so on. And so you want a document that's as close as possible to the historical events it's purporting to record. And the only documents that get you there in all of early Christianity, that get you in the first century at all, are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're the only ones. And there's scholarly agreement about that across the board. Now, a couple implications from that before we leave this first point that are, I think, fundamental. One is, this already gives us an inclination to think that the most reliable stories of Jesus we're going to get are going to be in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John because they are closest. So it already gives us the principle, the closer you get to the events of Jesus, the better. Okay, but there's a second implication which most people miss, and this is really critical. It means that when the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were published, if they were published in the first century, and they were, if they were published in the first century, that tells us that when those Gospels were published, there were other people still alive that had witnessed the things that they were discussing. There were other people that were still alive that had saw those things take place. In other words, when the four Gospels were written, there were other people around who could say, wait a second, that's not how it happened. That's not what took place. I was there. And this is the point that most people miss, is that if you're going to publish a gospel in the lifetime of the people who are eyewitnesses, you had better get your facts straight, because it's never going to see the light of day if it doesn't. Now, people all the time say, oh, that's not the way it worked in the ancient world. No one really cared about how you did history in the ancient world. It was a total free-for-all. No one paid attention to such things. That's simply not true. We have actually all kinds of discussions amongst Greco-Roman historians about how you do good history and what counts as good history and how you want to be as close to the events as possible, critiquing people for doing poor history. No, make no mistake about it. If you publish gospels in the first century and there are other people alive who had seen those things and you were just making it up, it never would have seen the light of day. What you have then, right out of the gate here, is a fundamental difference between our four gospels and every other gospel out there. These are the only gospels that get us back to the first century, to the time that Jesus actually did the things that are recorded in there. Now, on one level, you could stop here. I guess I could give you a one-point outline today. That'd be pretty nice, right? When's the last time you heard a one-point outline on anything? Usually in the world of sermons and lectures, it's 3, 4, 5, 7, what happens to be. Theoretically, I could just give you this one point, and that would be enough. That one fact. But there's so much more here that can be said. I think that's compelling enough. And by the way, notice how when you articulate that reality, that these are just the oldest ones we have, these gospels get us further and closer than any other gospel, your neighbor can understand that fact. Your neighbor can get that. They can understand that. And no other apocryphal gospel gets you to the first century. It's written many years later. Okay, second thing that sets our canonical gospels apart and makes them unique. Not just when they were written. First point was that they're the earliest gospels we have. The second is the canonical gospels have a credible connection to the apostles. The canonical gospels have a credible connection to the apostles. I want you to notice our first point was about the date of the gospels, which is really important when they were written. This second point is not just about the date. This second point is about the author of the gospels. If you wanted to get the best source for the life of Jesus, you wouldn't want just a gospel that was written as early as you could get. That would be good, and we have that in our 4. But you would also want a gospel written by someone who actually could have known these things, who actually could have seen these things. You would want a gospel written by an eyewitness, or at least someone who had an eyewitness right next to him to tell them what took place. In other words, if you wanted a gospel that was utterly reliable, you would want it written by some of Jesus' closest friends. Now, we know historically about the 12 apostles, the 12 disciples of Jesus, really 11 eventually after Judas committed suicide. We know these were his closest companions. These are the ones he relied on. These are the ones he poured his information into and his life into. If anybody would have known what Jesus was about, if anybody would have known the message of Christ, if anyone would have had a good shot of getting it right, it would have been these closest companions. Sure, someone from the outside might have been able to get the message right. Someone watching from a distance, Jesus do what he does, could have gotten the message right. But if you really want a good shot of getting the message right, to understand the nuts and bolts of who Jesus is and what he came to do and what his identity was, you're going to want to get access to his closest companions and what they thought. And here's the trick. The only gospels that even have a shot, and we would argue more than a shot, but the only gospels that even have a shot of getting you access to the apostles are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are the only gospels that we think were either written by apostles or written by the companion of an apostle who would have access to the information we're describing. Now, of course, in a session like this, we can't go into all the examples out there about how we know who wrote the gospels and how we know who the authors were and things like this. And so I can't go through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in this session and tell you how we know who wrote them, but I'll just give you one example, and that is focusing on the person of John and the Gospel of John. Let's just think about the Gospel of John for a moment. How do we know John wrote John? It says John on there, right? But how do we know he actually wrote it? How do we know he's the guy that was there at the Last Supper, who Jesus had him lean into Jesus' chest, and they were very close, and he was called the beloved disciple? How do we know that guy actually wrote the book? How do we know it's not a forgery or pseudonymous? How do we know it wasn't a later? How do we know that John wrote John? Well, there's all kinds of ways we can get at that, but I just want to point out one, and it's pretty fascinating. One of the ways we know the authors of these Gospels is by the testimony of the early church fathers that were really, really close to the time period. So how do we know John wrote John? Well, we have the testimony of a 2nd century church father by the name of Irenaeus. It tells us very plainly, John wrote John. It was the John who was there, disciple, leaned his head on Jesus' chest. That John wrote this gospel. Okay, so we have that testimony from Irenaeus. But how do we know Irenaeus is right? Well, we'd have to ask where Irenaeus got his information from. And without going into all the details, it's undoubtedly the case that he got his information from an earlier individual by the name of Polycarp, who was one of the earliest and most sort of well-known bishops in early Christianity. So how did Polycarp get that information? Well, here's the stunner. Polycarp was mentored by the Apostle John himself. In other words, the Apostle John mentored a guy named Polycarp who mentored a guy named Irenaeus. And Irenaeus comes along and says, hey, John wrote John. And he's only one person removed from John himself. Only one person. He knows the guy who got it from John. Now, on an historical level, I can tell you, that is a stunning, tight line of testimony. It's so powerful, in fact, that in a court of law, that would be a very compelling testimony, because you have to ask the question, what's the statistical chance that Irenaeus just got it wrong? Or what's the chance that Polycarp got it wrong? Well, he knows John himself. Or what's the chance he's lying or making it up? Well, fairly low when you look at the historical circumstances. All that points to one simple fact, that the person who wrote the gospel we call John was right there watching it happen. Now, if that's true for the canonical gospels, and we don't have time to go through, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. If that's true for the canonical gospels, what about the apocryphal gospels? Were they written by somebody who was there? Well, here's the amazing thing about the apocryphal gospels. We already know none of them are written in the first century. All of them are written in the second century or later, right? So if that's true, then none of the apocryphal gospels, they weren't even written in the first century, but they certainly weren't written by an eyewitness, nor were they written by someone who had access to an eyewitness so far after the fact. None of them could have had that same access to that truth. Now, people get hung up all the time on the names of these apocryphal gospels. Well, gee whiz, if it wasn't written by Thomas, why is it called the Gospel of Thomas? If it wasn't written by Peter, why is it called the Gospel of Peter? But you have to ask yourself, if you lived in the second century and you wanted to write a gospel that would get a hearing, what would you call it? You wouldn't call it Bob's Gospel, right? Bob's Gospel is not going to get a hearing. But if you call it Peter's Gospel, suddenly people are listening. Could Peter have written that? And it probably did fool some people. If you call it the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Philip, it would probably fool some people. But you know what's happening there? Those apocryphal Gospels are just mimicking what the canonical Gospels had already done by picking names of the followers of Jesus. We even have an apocryphal Gospel called the Gospel of the 12. It's almost like that Gospel says, well, I'll trump all of you. I've got a Gospel written by all 12 disciples. Here's the point. Even with all the rhetoric and all the labels and all the things, we know none of those Gospels give you access to the apostles themselves. And here's the implication of this second point. If we have a gospel in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that gives us access to the closest followers of Jesus, then not only do we have eyewitness testimony in our grasp, no other apocryphal gospel can say that, but we have authoritative eyewitness testimony in our grasp. Because the apostles weren't just friends of Jesus. They were commissioned by Jesus. They were given the authority of Jesus. They were sent out by Jesus. So to say that you have an apostolic gospel is not just to say you have an eyewitness gospel. To say you have an apostolic gospel is to say you have an eyewitness gospel that's also an authoritative gospel. Now, once you realize you have an authoritative gospel, then the idea that just any old gospel is as good as any other suddenly just kind of fades away. Because if you were trying to decide which gospel to trust, wouldn't you want a gospel that not only was early, but also written by somebody who was actually there or had access to somebody who was there? Make no mistake about it, with these first 2 points already, you can see that, wait a second, maybe it's not as arbitrary as people think. Maybe it's not just a free-for-all. Maybe there's a reason why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John ended up in our canons. Let's move on to the third of the 4 points. First one was the canonical gospels are the earliest. The second is the canonical gospels are the only ones with a credible connection to the apostles. The third is the canonical gospels lack the legendary embellishments of later gospels. They lack the legendary embellishments of later gospels. And one of the things I've discovered over the years, talking a lot about the early Christian church and the canon and apocryphal gospels and canonical gospels, one of the things I've discovered over the years is not many people have actually read the apocryphal gospels. In fact, I would argue that not many people have actually read the canonical gospels. That's another discussion altogether. But at least more of them have. And so when I tell someone, look, these are qualitatively different kinds of writings, people just shrug and go, yeah, so you say. But the truth of the matter is most people haven't read them, because when you read the canonical gospels and you read them alongside books like the Gospel of Peter or the Gospel of Philip or the Gospel of Thomas, you realize there's something very different going on here. And here's one of the things that you notice. You begin to realize how restrained and how matter of fact and sort of how almost like a newspaper reporter the canonical Gospels are. You never notice that because you just read them and think, okay, here's the Gospels we have. But when you compare them to these other texts, you realize those other texts are loaded with all kinds of obvious embellishments, extraneous material, bizarre and strange content, and stuff that is clearly superfluous and added later. And you begin to realize there's something very unusual going on when you read the canonical Gospels. And I'll give you a couple examples just to sort of highlight what I'm talking about. You ever notice how when you read the canonical Gospels that you never actually see the resurrection take place when you read them? I don't know if you ever noticed this before. In the canonical Gospels, when you look at the resurrection accounts, you have the resurrection accounts, and when the women show up at the tomb, what's already taken place? Jesus has already risen from the dead. In fact, he's not only risen from the dead, he's not even there anymore. So the resurrection has already happened, and you show up on the scene in the narrative with it already having taken place. Now, it's never dawned on you that if someone were actually just concocting a gospel and the resurrection was the centerpiece of their narrative, wouldn't you actually want to show it happening? Wouldn't you actually create a scenario where there was an eyewitness of it taking place, where you actually see Jesus come out of the tomb? That would seem compelling to me. In fact, you could see how that might be an even more powerful testimony to the resurrection of Jesus. But what's amazing is that when you read the canonical Gospels, that's not what you get. In fact, you get what seems to have really happened. They showed up and it already took place. You don't get to watch it happen. It's amazingly restrained for an historical report. I'll give you a second example of the restraint in the canonical Gospels, and that is how little we know about the childhood of Jesus in the canonical Gospels. Now, of course, we have that one story of Jesus as a boy in the temple in Luke. Okay, that's there. But outside of that, there's not much there. And you can imagine how curious people might be about something like that. I mean, if you wrote a gospel, wouldn't you want to include something about Jesus as a child? Wouldn't that be something you'd want to say something about? Wouldn't that be something you'd want to know something about? Don't you think your listeners would want to hear something about that? And wouldn't you wonder things like, I wonder what Jesus was like when he was growing up. I wonder if he ever got spanked by his parents, I wonder if he ever got in trouble. I wonder what he was like as this little son of God running around. I wonder how many times his brothers and sisters heard the phrase, why can't you be more like your brother Jesus, right? What was it like for Jesus as a boy? Now, when you read the canonical Gospels, what's incredible is how restrained. They just don't dump all these stories in there, even though the curiosity must have been immense. Now, you don't notice the oddity of that, and when I say oddity, I mean it positively here, the uniqueness of that when you haven't read apocryphal Gospels. If you've read apocryphal Gospels, you realize they have very little of this, most of them. They have all kinds of obvious legendary embellishments. So let me ask this question. How many here have not just heard of, but have actually read the Gospel of Thomas? 7, 8, maybe 10 here. By the way, Steve Nichols, that's probably a good sign here at Reformation Bible College, right? You don't want your students necessarily doing their devotions in the Gospel of Thomas. Okay, let me ask a second question. How many here have not just heard of, but have actually read the Gospel of Peter? Maybe one hand, two? Okay, so this group is statistically consistent with most of the groups I speak at. Most people haven't read them. But let me tell you, when you go to these apocryphal Gospels, you're going to see something in both these areas. So let me give you an example of where we see Jesus resurrected from the dead and we see Jesus as a boy in these examples. I'll start with the resurrection of the dead. When we read a gospel called the Gospel of Peter, not written by Peter, written by someone we don't know who in the late 2nd, maybe early 3rd century, the Gospel of Peter actually shows you the resurrection happening. Later today, you can Google it don't do it now, but later today, you can go Google the Gospel of Peter and you can read about it, and it shows you the resurrection taking place. What the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John don't show you, the Gospel of Peter actually shows you. And so what happens? The tomb opens up and out comes Jesus, and you get to see it happen. But as soon as you start maybe thinking, well, this is kind of cool, then bizarre things start to happen in this gospel. Because first of all, when Jesus comes out of the tomb, he isn't the Jesus you and I know and think of, because this Jesus isn't a normal Jesus. This is a giant Jesus. This is a Jesus whose head touches the clouds Jesus. This is like a 60-foot Jesus. This is what I tell my students I call the Godzilla Jesus coming out of the tomb, okay? But then it gets even more bizarre because Jesus is coming out of the tomb, and following him out of the tomb is the cross itself. Now, there's so many things strange about it. First of all, how'd the cross get in the tomb? It's not that the Romans normally say, well, since you got crucified, here's a gift to take home with you. You can take this cross. Here, you can have it in the tomb. So we don't know how the cross got in the tomb. But here's the thing. How is it following Jesus out of the tomb? Is it floating? Is it walk? Do we have a floating cross here following giant Jesus out of the tomb? Just as you think it gets weird enough, then something else happens. The cross starts talking. Now you're thinking, what, am I dreaming? What is going on? So you've got giant Jesus with a floating, walking, talking cross out of Jesus, and this gives you a taste of what the different gospels are. And then when someone comes and goes, oh, just pick whatever gospel suits your fancy. You're thinking to yourself, hold on a second, is there not a place to talk about historical reliability in these texts? Now, I'll give you a second example of this. The first example was the resurrection of Jesus. The second example is Jesus' boy. You may not realize that we have gospels in early Christianity that tell us what Jesus was like as a child. So if you've always had your curiosity piqued, here's your shot, right? You can go and read what's called the infancy gospel of Thomas. By the way, the infancy gospel of Thomas is not to be confused with the gospel of Thomas, discovered by our friend Muhammad Ali. No, the infancy gospel of Thomas was much later, but it tells about Jesus as a boy. And it gets into all the things you'd want to know about what Jesus must have been like as a boy. But here's what's bizarre. Once you start reading it, you realize this is a rather terrifying little Jesus in this story. This is a nightmarish Jesus. This is a scary Jesus. This is an unpredictable little kid Jesus. This little kid Jesus in the infancy gospel of Thomas goes around terrorizing the village he lives in. He bumps into another kid who bumps into him, and he strikes him dead on the spot. And then when the village leaders get on his case about it, he just rises them from the dead. And then another point, he's making these clay pigeons on the Sabbath day, breaking the Sabbath rule. When he's confronted about it, he turns them into real pigeons and they fly away and the evidence is gone. And this little Jesus is not like the Jesus you would think. He's someone that you think, wow, I don't want to have anything to do with this little Jesus. And this is an example, yet again, of the obvious, deep, profound literary embellishments that go on in Gospels outside the canonical four. And you never would know it if you hadn't actually read them. And that leads us to our fourth and final observation. And by the way, there's not just four. These are, I think, good four. I mean, you can make the case much longer than this. Remember where we've gone so far. The canonical Gospels are the earliest we have. Second, the canonical Gospels are the only ones that have a credible shot of being written by the apostles. Third, the canonical Gospels lack the legendary embellishments of later Gospels. And now, fourth and finally, the canonical Gospels were recognized as authoritative from a very early date. One of the questions that we want to ask when we think about which Gospels to trust is a question of which Gospels the early Christians trusted. Which Gospels did they read? Which Gospels did they like? Which Gospels did they copy? Which Gospels did they put on their lists and affirm? Now, here's what the media will tell you, and this is what scholars will say to you. They'll say, oh, in early Christianity, it was a literary free-for-all, and there was no one gospel more popular than another. In fact, in the earliest stages, they would say, it was probably apocryphal gospels that were more popular than even the canonical ones. And it was only later through the machinations of Constantine and the political pressure that they ended up forcing Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John on a church that really never liked them very much anyway. I can tell you that narrative is everywhere. It's on the internet. It's in web chat rooms. It's in books, unfortunately. It's in all kinds of places, and it's patently false. When you look at early Christianity and ask which Gospels were the most popular, which were the most read, which are the ones the early church affirmed, from as far back as we can see, it is almost unanimously Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. A few examples. Irenaeus in the 2nd century. We ask him, how many Gospels, Irenaeus? He says 4, and only 4. In fact, so certain that there's 4, you could almost think of it as the 4 directions of the world, or the 4 creatures around the throne, or the 4 covenants of the Bible, or, Irenaeus has all these explanations, but for him it's 4 and only 4. Our earliest canonical list, the Muratorian fragment. You read it and go, wonder how many Gospels people are reading. The answer is 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Clement of Alexandria, also in the 2nd century. We ask him, how many Gospels should we read? What's interesting about Clement is he actually read lots of things, and he actually read a lot of other Gospels. And sometimes he even quote from them from time to time. But when you ask him which ones belong in our canon, Clement was very obviously clear. He said 4 and only 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. How about the apocryphal Gospels? How'd they do in early Christianity? Were they wildly popular, as we're told? What's interesting is when you look in the early church, the evidence for them is incredibly scant in terms of their impact and popularity. I'll give you a few little historical tidbits to flesh this out. Here's one for you. We don't have a single manuscript in the entire history of early Christianity that includes apocryphal Gospels and canonical Gospels in the same book. And this is a stunning fact, because I can tell you, when we look at early Christianity, we see manuscripts all the time of the Gospels. We have thousands of them. And lots of times we have manuscripts that include multiple Gospels in a single volume. We have tons of these. But here's what we never find. We never find multiple Gospels in a single volume when they're mixed between canonical and apocryphal. So, for example, we never find a codex anywhere that's got, say, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Thomas, or Matthew, Mark, John, and Peter. We don't find an example of that once, anywhere, ever. Now, if you think about that for a moment, how is that possible if we're to believe that in early Christianity that these apocryphal texts were just everywhere and no one made a difference or a distinction between them? No, they made a distinction. A second little tidbit. We don't have a single canonical list anywhere that contains both canonical and apocryphal Gospels. It's interesting, Christians very early on in the 2nd century, we know for sure, began to list books that they received in their canons. They began to write it out. Here's the ones we recognize. Here's the ones we have. We have all kinds of examples of these lists, starting in the 2nd century. They particularly become prolific in the 4th and 5th century and beyond. Here's one thing that's interesting about these lists. We don't have a single example of any list anywhere where they mix these Gospels together. Whenever you read these lists, guess what the Gospels are? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. One last little historical tidbit for you about the popularity of these apocryphal Gospels. We can know something about the popularity of books by the number of manuscripts they left behind, the quantity of copies that we can get our hands on. You see, in the ancient world, you didn't replicate a book by going down and running off copies on a copy machine or going to the publisher. You'd have to make hand copies by a scribe, and they would get circulated throughout the world. So you really just copy the books you really wanted to read and have spread. And so when you look in the historical record, we can tell what books were popular by the fragments of those books left behind, because then we can tell which books were mostly copied and mostly read and mostly circulated. So the number of manuscripts left behind is incredibly important to know which books were popular. When we look at our canonical Gospels, we have thousands of manuscripts. I can't get into the numbers now. When you look at the whole New Testament, we have well over 5,700 copies. But in the canonical Gospels themselves, we have several thousand copies. How many copies do we have of, say, the Gospel of Thomas? The answer is 3. In fact, they're very fragmentary, poorly preserved 3rd century Greek texts that you can hardly get any text at all from that. The Gospel of Thomas that was discovered by Muhammad Ali was not in Greek, it was in Coptic. When we're talking about manuscripts, we're always talking about these numbers in Greek. You could do the same thing with the other canonical Gospels. Some apocryphal Gospels. Some apocryphal Gospels have left 0 manuscripts. And the only reason we know they exist is because a patristic writer just says something about them and mentions them. Some apocryphal Gospels are never mentioned by any patristic writer ever. And we only know about them because we happen to randomly find one in the desert. I'll give you examples of the Gospel of Mary. We actually only have about 3 copies of the Gospel of Mary, but no patristic writer even mentions its name. Not even mentions its name. We wouldn't even know it exists if we hadn't just found these things in the desert. Now, those are just little tidbits to make the larger point. And the larger point is simply this. When someone comes along and says, oh, in the early church, it was all the same. It was a level playing field. Everyone was reading whatever they wanted to read. There was no preference for certain books. It was just a free-for-all. It was only later this got settled. That's not true. In fact, the historical evidence is all pointing in one direction, and we're not talking leaning in one direction. We're talking a mountain, a flood, a torrent of evidence in the other direction. And so when you look at the question of which Gospels were received, were read, were valued, were appreciated, it is not even close. It is almost uniformly, almost always from the very beginning, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, as we draw these 4 points together, and as we draw this session to a close, these 4 points hold together the fundamental point from the beginning we're making. And that is, despite our culture's quest for diversity, and despite our culture's desire to have their sort of choice of worldview and choice of philosophy and choice of religion as if it's kind of a cafeteria-style thing where you go in and you just pick what you want and it's all the same. That is the narrative of our world. But that narrative comes to a screeching halt when you actually look at the historical evidence. When you actually look at the historical evidence, that narrative can't be sustained. And when it comes to the 4 Gospels, that narrative certainly can't be sustained. And when it comes to the 4 Gospels, the record has always been clear. If you want to know what Jesus is like, if you want to know who he was and what he did and what he said, there's only one place Christians have really ever gone. And it's the same place that we go today, and that's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Amen. Let me pray for us. Lord, we thank you for the clarity of your word. Lord, we thank you for its power. Lord, we thank you for its historical presence, that we can look back and see that you've made it clear what testimony you're leaving behind for the person of Jesus. Lord, encourage us today with that truth. May we leave this place confident, renewed in our trust that your word is true and reliable. And may we be able to articulate that to a world who desperately needs to hear the message of grace. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen.